He didn't call the cops when he found out who broke her arm. He called his hitmen. Elena was just an invisible maid trying to pay off her brother's deadly $50,000 debt to the Russian mob. But when her boss, a notorious Mafia kingpin, sees her bruised and battered body, he demands names. She gave him one name, Sergei Volkov. Within 24 hours, Volkov's entire criminal empire was dismantled, and Elena realized the man she works for is a monster who kills to protect what's his.
Let us open this story together, you and I, and examine the exact moment a life irreversibly fractures. Picture the scene. The penthouse is bathed in the cold blue light of early dawn. It smells heavy, a suffocating blend of rich leather and the metallic undertone of quiet violence. Elena Marlowe had survived 6 months in this gilded cage by remaining an absolute ghost. Survival often demands we erase ourselves, a tragic but necessary defense. But at exactly 7:03 a.m., the camera lingers as her hand trembles. Hot coffee spills across pristine Italian marble. In the background, completely motionless, stands Victor D'Angelo. New York's most feared predator does not believe in coincidences. He watches her mask slip. We learn the hard way that hiding our pain only draws the wolves closer. This single lapse pulls her directly into a megalomaniac's terrifying orbit. Watch how Elena moves through the vast corridors of the penthouse. She drifts like an apparition, deliberately making herself entirely forgettable. It is the tragic choreography of a trauma victim. But beneath her uniform, her left arm pulses with a blinding, agonizing heat. 4 days ago, the bone was shattered. Now it shifts beneath her skin with every breath, a sickening grind of fractures wrapped tightly in cheap gauze. She refuses to stop working, terrified of what happens if she slows down. But here is a simple truth we must all face. Running from our deepest pain only guarantees it will eventually consume us. She cannot seek a doctor. A doctor means questions, and questions mean a death sentence for her foolish younger brother, Marco. He gambled his life with predators who collect their debts in shattered limbs and spilled blood. Like so many desperate souls, she chooses silent compliance. She keeps working, quietly bleeding into her own sleeve. Notice the tension in her posture as she grips the heavy silver coffee pot. She anchors it against her hip, just to pour into a delicate porcelain cup, worth more than her life. When suffering reaches this limit, your universe shrinks entirely to the next ragged breath. Because of this, she never hears the deliberate footsteps behind her. "You are shaking," a voice murmurs. The sound is low, perfectly flat, devoid of warmth. Men like Victor do not need to raise their voice to rip the oxygen from a room. Elena freezes. She turns with an agonizing slowness, trying to paint a mask of absolute normalcy across her terrified features. Victor stands framed in the doorway, a terrifying monument of dark, tailored authority. Look closely at his face in the dim lighting. Victor possesses a terrifying gravitational pull. His striking symmetry would be beautiful if his eyes were not entirely hollow, drained of human empathy. In the shadows, they call him the Reaper, because once he passes judgment, his verdict is absolute. "I am fine, Mr. D'Angelo," Elena replies. Miraculously, her voice is steady. It is a tragic defense mechanism, feigning strength, while her body begs to collapse. We often learn that true resilience is just holding back the tears until you are finally alone. Victor does not blink, her with the same surgical, predatory gaze he uses to dismantle rival empires. "Your hand," he states coldly. She looks down, betraying her fragile lie. Her fingers tremble violently. Defeated, she sets the pot down and folds them together like a silent prayer. "I did not sleep well," she whispers, offering a fragile excuse. Victor steps forward, Every slow movement is a calculated invasion of her sanctuary. The heavy silence amplifies the sound of his shoes on the marble. "You have worked here for 6 months," he murmurs. "You have never shaken before." Elena's pulse hammers against her throat in pure panic. She needs him to turn away, to stop dissecting her soul like a broken toy. She is meant to be a shadow. "I am sorry if I disturbed you," she pleads softly. But he stops just 3 feet away. The proximity is suffocating. She can clearly see the faint, jagged scar along his jaw. Flight is no longer an option. "Show me your arm." The words drop into the space between them, like a heavy physical weight. You see, a man forged in ultimate power never asks a question. He only ever demands total, inescapable submission. She considers a desperate lie. She even calculates the distance to the elevator, a futile hope considering her shattered body. But the dark, predatory intelligence shimmering in Victor's eyes warns her that deception would be a fatal mistake. To lie to a man who lives in the shadows only proves his darkest suspicions correct. Trapped in this agonizing dilemma, she finally surrenders. Slowly, her trembling hand pulls the ruined limb from behind her back. Even buried beneath layers of dark fabric, the violent swelling is impossible to hide. Her wrist slumps at a horrifying, broken angle. She fought so hard to appear unbroken, reminding us that no matter how fiercely we deny our pain, our bodies will always confess the truth. The camera holds on Victor's face. His expression is completely dead. He studies the grotesque shape with the cold detachment of a mortician. "Take off the sleeve," he commands. She opens her mouth to beg, but he severs her protest with one flat, crushing syllable. Now, the psychological weight of that word is absolute, carrying a tone that completely erases the possibility of refusal. Her uninjured hand shakes uncontrollably as she fumbles with the buttons, slowly peeling the heavy fabric up past her elbow. The crude bandage crumbles away, leaving the brutalized flesh exposed to the harsh light. Violent purple bruises stain her skin, fading into sickening shades of black. The bone pushes outward in a tragic deformation. The room plunges into a suffocating silence. Victor does not react. He stands as still as a statue, letting his eyes absorb every horrific detail. When he finally looks back up into her weeping eyes, there is no pity. Instead, something far more dangerous settles over him, a terrifying, total possessiveness. "Who did this?" he asks softly. Elena forces down the panic. "It was an accident. I fell." Notice this tragic instinct. You and I have likely seen this desperate defense before, the way a wounded soul shields the world from its misery. But Victor shatters the illusion instantly. "Elena." He speaks her name like a loaded weapon. "I have broken enough bones to know what a fall looks like. This was not a fall." She stares blankly at the marble counter. If she tells the truth, her brother is dead. If she lies, she loses everything anyway. "It does not matter," she whispers, her spirit completely broken. "It does to me," Victor replies smoothly. A hollow, fractured laugh escapes her lips. "Why? You do not even know who I am." Victor's expression turns lethal, revealing his darkest nature. "You work in my home. That makes you mine." It is a terrifying salvation, wrapped entirely in ownership. Elena shakes her head, trying to reason with a man who rewrites reality to suit his whims. "You do not want this problem." Victor closes the remaining distance, his towering shadow swallowing her completely. He forces her to look up, her tear-streaked face reflecting in his bottomless eyes. "I did not ask if I wanted it," he says, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I am telling you that you will explain, and then I am going to fix it." When she weakly begs him to understand that he cannot, his response freezes the blood in her veins. "Test me." There is no comfort here, only the certainty of a predator who has never met a force he could not slaughter. Under the crushing weight of his unyielding will, her exhausted mind finally breaks. We eventually learn that sometimes simply surrendering our burden is the only way to survive. My brother, she breathes out into the sterile air. Marco, she sobs. He borrowed money from the wrong people. The camera captures a microscopic shift in Victor's jaw, a tightening of lethal calculation. How much? $50,000, she confesses. Her brother thought he could outrun the devil, but the compounding interest became a steel trap. Elena shuts her eyes, reliving the horror. The creditors no longer wanted the cash. They wanted to force Marco into their bloody trade, using him to exact their violent tolls. When he desperately tried to walk away, they needed a way to force his hand. Her voice shatters entirely as she remembers the sickening sound of the metal pipe snapping her bone, a brutal receipt for his disobedience. It reminds us that the sins of the reckless are always paid for by the innocent. When she opens her weeping eyes, Victor's face is a terrifying, unrecognizable void. Names, Victor demands. The stark simplicity of the command cuts through the room like a blade. Elena stares back at him, her body completely flooded with adrenaline. No, please, if they find out I told anyone. Victor savors her panic with a statement so chillingly factual it stops her heart. They will not find out. They will be dead. Watch his posture. There is no arrogant swagger here, only a cold, clinical guarantee of incoming slaughter. She realizes the profound, tragic irony of her existence. To place her faith in a diagnosed killer is sheer madness, yet remaining silent promises the exact same grave. Sometimes the only choice left is deciding which monster will consume you. Sergei Volkov, she whispers, finally surrendering the deadly truth. Sergei ruled the city's dark underbelly of extortion, and he held Marco. Victor's dark eyes seem to swallow the morning light. Volkov, I know of him. Without looking away, Victor pulls out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen with lethal purpose. He has been expanding into territories he should not, Victor mutters. I have been waiting for a viable reason to remind him where the boundaries are. Elena feels her blood turn to ice. Watch how easily the narcissist absorbs another's human suffering, twisting her tragedy to fuel his own bloody narrative. This is not about territory, she cries out softly. This is about my brother. Victor lowers the phone, his dead gaze pinning her in place. It is about both now. His mind is already miles away, processing the grim timeline like a cold machine. Marco's last terrified call was 2 days ago. Victor aligns these pieces into a pattern of violence only he can see. When ego and vengeance collide, that's always catastrophic. You are going to the hospital, he dictates, leaving no room for debate. Right now, she tries to protest the impossible cost, but Victor is already turning his back. I will handle it, he commands. Luca will take you. When you are discharged, you return directly here. You do not go home. You contact no one. Understood? Elena stands paralyzed, sensing a massive shift in gravity. Wait, what are you going to do? Victor pauses at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. His face is flawlessly calm, but his hollow eyes reveal the quiet calculus of a man scheduling a massacre. I am going to retrieve your brother, he answers, his voice an empty abyss. And then I am going to make certain no one ever touches you again. He dissolves into the shadows before she can even breathe. We must recognize that true protection is sometimes just another form of captivity. Moments later, Luca appears, a silent, hulking shadow made of solid stone. Let us step inside this moving tomb of steel together. The armored vehicle swallows the city noise. leaving only a suffocating silence. Elena cradles her shattered arm, her mind fracturing under an impossible reality. The most lethal predator in the city just vowed to rescue her brother. She is not his blood, just a maid who scrubs his floors. The boss never does things halfway. Luca rumbles, his voice vibrating like heavy machinery. If he says he will bring him back, he will. Elena studies the giant, her breath ragged. Have you worked for him long? 8 years, he replies. Is he always this intense? A microscopic twitch alters his granite jaw. That is one word for his pathology. You and I know that sometimes salvation comes from the monsters we fear most. Watch how the ambient streetlights wash over Elena's pale face as the vehicle merges onto the interstate. Her mind is actively fracturing under the sheer, crushing weight of the hour.
She speaks aloud.
Her paralyzing fear regarding her brother Marco's fragile mortality. Terrified of the bloody retaliation the Volkov Syndicate will inevitably unleash, Luca, draped in the cold detachment of a lifelong soldier, answers her with chilling certainty. There are no half measures when a man like his superior commits to a war. Elena's guilt spills out as desperate regret, the frantic burning of a traumatized soul. But Luca swiftly cuts through her panic. He validates her betrayal, framing it not as a sin, but as a mandatory survival mechanism against a truly parasitic enemy. Luca's defense of his employer opens a fascinating, tragic window into his own scarred psyche. He softly explains that the syndicate leader steps into the dark for defenseless victims because of a historical, unresolved grief. A phantom loss entirely dictates the kingpin's current violent behavioral patterns. Elena absorbs this heavy revelation, desperately trying to humanize the apex predator who now holds her fate. But Luca abruptly terminates the conversation, his ingrained boundaries slamming shut. As he deposits her at the clinical medical facility, the triage environment operates as a harsh microcosm of human suffering, the air thick with the scent of sterile iodine and raw, terrified sweat. Elena waits among the bleeding and the broken, just another fragile soul caught in the merciless, grinding wheel of primal survival. The sudden, harsh vibration of an unidentified caller acts as a violent jolt to Elena's exhausted nervous system. Against every shred of self-preservation, she answers the device. Her brother Marco's voice crackles through the speaker, his frantic fluctuation signaling pure, unadulterated panic. He speaks of an imminent relocation, the classic isolation tactic of executioners. But the moment Elena confesses the involvement of the kingpin Vittorio D'Angelo, Marco's psychological state shatters from fear into absolute, blinding terror. He correctly sees Vittorio not as a savior wrapped in light, but as a megalomaniac who moves vulnerable pawns across a blood-stained board for his own grandiosity. Marco realizes with crushing clarity that his sister just accelerated their execution timeline. Marco frantically outlines the lethal mathematics of their doomed reality. If the Volkov Syndicate traces this interference to Vittorio, Marco's execution shifts from a mere possibility to a mandatory demonstration of dominance. The abrupt, dead dial tone leaves Elena in a horrific state of sensory freefall. Her entire body trembles uncontrollably as the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake settles over her like a shroud. A nurse calls her name, forcing a fragile compartmentalization of her spiraling panic. For the next 2 agonized hours, she endures mechanical repairs, a heavy fiberglass cast, and cold chemical numbing agents. She emerges fundamentally hollowed out, carrying that profound, bone-deep exhaustion that always follows a devastating cascade of desperate survival choices. Pay close attention to the sheer psychological dissonance. tearing Elena apart. Luca waits silently by the vehicle, delivering a chilling summons directly from the kingpin. Elena steps into the transport, completely paralyzed by the warring urges to either halt Vittorio's violent momentum or surrender to it entirely. She craves a protector, even a monstrous one. Because her own strength has failed her, life teaches us that desperation makes any shelter look inviting. They return to the towering penthouse, a cold environment engineered to project absolute dominance. Vittorio stands framed against the panoramic glass, silently surveying the sprawling urban grid below. His rigid posture is the physical manifestation of a man observing an empire he fully believes he owns by divine right. Notice how seamlessly Vittorio establishes his physical dominance the moment she enters. He commands her to sit without offering a fraction of eye contact. Elena obeys, using her fractured limb as a physical anchor in a space devoid of human warmth. Vittorio begins the debriefing with quiet, surgical precision, stripping every ounce of emotional resonance from the crisis. He recites the coordinates of the Volkov facility and calmly details the shifts of the armed guards. When she begs for reassurance about Marco's safety, Vittorio refuses to offer empty comfort. He clinically defines her brother's continued breathing not as good fortune, but as a calculated delay tactic by sadistic men who merely wish to stretch out their total, agonizing control over another human life. Driven by a desperate familial bond, Elena attempts to weave herself into the tactical planning using the inclusive word we. Vittorio instantly crushes this perceived boundary violation. He dictates a regimen of absolute passivity for her, reserving every ounce of aggressive action for himself. But the agonizing thought of her brother's suffering briefly overrides her exhaustion, flooding her veins with adrenaline. She challenges his unyielding authority, arguing that this blood is on her hands. Vittorio dissects her fragile defiance with terrifying clinical efficiency. He forces her to confront the grim statistical probability of her own death if she steps onto the battlefield, coldly categorizing her deep emotional love as nothing more than an unacceptable operational liability. Backed against his impenetrable logic, Elena probes the dark motivation behind his intention. Vittorio's response is a terrifying masterclass in grandiosity. He plainly states that he does not permit subjects to bleed within his domain. This is not human empathy. It is the cold enforcement of his absolute territorial sovereignty. The sheer weight of this declaration silences the vast room. Elena, her throat tight with panic, attempts to share Marco's desperate warning about Volkov's inevitable retaliation. Vittorio absorbs this data without a single micro-expression of concern. He smoothly dismisses Marco's terror as the miscalculation of an inferior mind, promising with quiet menace that Volkov will never even be granted the breath to strike back. Vittorio validates his chilling certainty by referencing his long tenure atop the predatory food chain of the underworld. He places photographic evidence of the target structure on the desk, clinically dissecting the architectural vulnerabilities and the enemy's foolish deployment. He exposes Volkov's current high-profile location as a rudimentary psychological misdirection. When Elena realizes the extraction timeline is immediate, her anxiety spikes uncontrollably. The air grows incredibly thin as Vittorio issues a direct, unyielding command for her blind trust. This is the ultimate manipulation, a powerful man demanding total psychological surrender from a shattered soul. She desperately wishes to believe in his omnipotence, yet her primal survival instincts violently, deeply resist, Consider the agonizing variable of the aftermath, a tension you and I can deeply feel bleeding into the room. Elena whispers a question about the post-extraction reality. Vittorio chillingly conditions their future on Volkov's capacity for rational retreat. A highly improbable outcome. The next few hours drag Elena into profound psychological torture. Confined in the opulent guest quarters, she is trapped in a suffocating loop of catastrophic visualizations. At 2300 hours, Luca initiates the deployment sequence. When he attempts to enforce her strict isolation, Elena's trauma responses suddenly crystallize into rigid, unbreakable defiance. She firmly overrides his directive, entirely refusing to be left behind as a helpless observer to her brother's bloody fate. Luca steps into her path, warning her of the Kingpin's inevitable retribution if she disobeys. Elena counters by demanding his complicity in a dangerous deception. Here, we witness a fascinating fracture in Luca's rigid allegiance. His loyalty gives way slightly, revealing a suppressed admiration for her suicidal courage. True bravery often inspires even the hardest hearts. They descend to the subterranean extraction point. Vittorio, radiating a dark, lethal focus, instantly registers her unauthorized presence. He does not waste a single breath on vocal escalation. Instead, he delegates the ultimate responsibility for her physical survival entirely onto Luca. It is a cold, sociopathic transfer of liability, ensuring his own mind remains purely, ruthlessly tactical. The extraction team penetrates the desolate industrial sector, a wasteland devoid of civilian eyes. The vehicle halts just short of their objective. Vittorio rotates to address Elena, establishing an unbreakable verbal contract. His parameters are absolute, mandatory immobilization, complete silence, and total reliance on Luca for emergency egress. He forces her to speak her compliance aloud, locking her into the agreement. The sharp, mechanical sounds of firearms being chambered echo loudly in the confined space, serving as terrifying auditory anchors to the impending violence. When Elena desperately asks for a personnel count to quantify their advantage, Vittorio's response is deliberately opaque. To a true predator, the exact metrics of violence are always completely irrelevant. The shadows seem to swallow Vittorio and Luca whole, leaving Elena in a suffocating void. Every second stretches into an agonizing eternity, her ears straining against the heavy silence until the night is torn apart by the deafening crack of gunfire. It isn't a messy shootout. The rhythmic bursts paint a picture of cold, calculated execution. Her heart hammers in her chest, her entire body screaming to run, yet she remains frozen, trapped by the terrifying bargain she's made. The gunfire stops as abruptly as it began. Figures stagger out of the blood-soaked building. Among the trembling survivors is Marco, battered, hollow, but breathing. Luca steps out of the gloom right behind him, a silent guardian shepherding a broken flock. Look closely at this moment. Elena finally shatters her frozen posture, Fessa throwing herself at her brother, desperate to feel that he is alive. Marco's emotional restraint crumbles the second she touches him. He clings to her, reduced by pure terror to a frightened child. Then Vittorio emerges. He steps from the massacre with hands painted in blood, yet his face is perfectly smooth, devoid of even a flicker of regret. When Elena tearfully offers him her gratitude, the words bounce off his deadened eyes. He doesn't care. He turns his back and walks into the slaughterhouse. It teaches us a brutal truth about life. Sometimes the people who save us do not care about us at all, and true safety is something we must build entirely for ourselves. You and I are going to look at this together, stepping right into the heavy aftermath of surviving the unthinkable. They hurried Marco to Victor's safe house in Queens, a gray, invisible building meant to vanish into the concrete. Elena stayed glued to her brother's side, her hand pressed hard into his shoulder, desperately trying to anchor him to the living world. Marco was drowning in shock. He just sat there, his face buried deep in his trembling hands, unable to process that he was actually breathing. He knew exactly what Victor was, a dangerous predator who never handed out favors for free. Marco understood a very dark life lesson right then. Sometimes the hand pulling you from the fire only wants to watch you burn on its own terms later. We watch Elena wrestle with a deeply confusing reality. A dangerous seed is taking root in her mind, creating a twisted urge to defend the very monster who holds her captive, simply because he gave them a roof for the night. She couldn't yet see the sprawling, terrifying map of Victor's grand design. Instead, she turned her intensity onto Marco, demanding he pull himself together while refusing to hide her shattered arm, a brutal, visual reminder of the debt he owed. She didn't soften the blow, and maybe she shouldn't have. It highlights a harsh but essential truth we all eventually face. Looking squarely at our own destructive mistakes is the first agonizing step toward real redemption. Outside the glass, the city slept, blind to Victor spinning his web of control. The dead quiet of that safe house felt less like sanctuary and more like a sealed tomb. Elena spent the endless night pacing, flinching at the sweep of every passing headlight and the wail of every distant siren. Outside, Luca stood like a statue in the shadows, his hushed phone conversations bleeding a thick paranoia into the room. By 3 a.m, Marco's battered nervous system finally gave out. He collapsed into a tight fetal position, seeking the lost comfort of their childhood. Just yesterday, Elena was living a perfectly normal, quiet life. Now she was just another piece on a ruthless mob boss's chessboard. It leaves us with a deeply unsettling lesson. The stability we build our lives upon is often just a fragile illusion waiting to break. The air in the room turns instantly to lead the moment. Victor walks through the door just before dawn. He doesn't shout. He doesn't have to. He simply announces that Volkov's entire empire has been erased, with 15 key players neatly handed over to the feds. He delivers this devastating victory, not with pride, but with the chilling, mechanical precision of a surgeon. He despises chaos. By carefully turning his enemy's own careless ledgers against them, he proves just how effortlessly he can dissect a human life. It is terrifying to watch, but it carries a vital lesson for anyone paying Von attention. True control in this world is never accidentally stumbled upon or freely given. It is ruthlessly and systematically engineered by those willing to do the ugly math. Let us take a closer look at how power truly moves in a room. When Marco opens his eyes and sees Victor standing there, you can see his entire body seize with pure animal panic. Victor tells him to relax, but his voice is entirely flat, carrying the hollow calm of a predator that knows it has already won. He talks about destroyed empires and men rotting in prison cells as casually as if he were discussing the weather. He wants Marco to know that the threat is gone, wiped out by his hand alone. There is a deeply unsettling reality embedded in this dark exchange, one we cannot ignore. True, absolute power never needs to raise its voice. It simply states the cold facts and sits back as the rest of the world scrambles to fall in line. Stick with me, because this is where the mask slips and the real horror begins. Marco foolishly asks why Victor did it, and Victor's answer is bone-chilling. There is no mercy or kindness here, only a dark, territorial claim over Elena. He looks at human beings, the way a collector looks at rare coins. You can see the sickness in Elena's eyes as she realizes she has been claimed as property, yet her throat closes up. She says nothing. She is paralyzed by the sick truth that this monster's obsession is the only reason her brother isn't in a morgue. It exposes a deeply tragic paradox of the human condition. Sometimes, the very cages that strip away our freedom are the exact same things keeping us breathing. Victor then orders them into exile upstate, locking the cage door tight. Elena tries to fight back, stammering about her job and her bills. It is a heartbreaking, desperate reach for a normal life that no longer exists. Victor shatters that illusion in seconds, using Marco's near-death experience as a heavy weapon to force her into submission. He wraps himself in the role of the ultimate provider, cutting off her independence piece by piece. When Marco nervously asks if Russians will come for revenge, Victor doesn't even blink. The faint, terrifying ghost of a smile touches his lips. It is the absolute confidence of a man who owns the shadows. We learn a very sobering lesson watching him stand there. The most dangerous people in the room are never the ones making a lot of noise. They are the ones who observe the chaos in dead silence. Victor tells them they will be gone for 3 weeks, his tone matching a prison warden locking down his block. Then he simply walks out, leaving Elena and Marco drowning in the heavy wake of his control. Marco sees it clearly. He knows the man is a monster, but Elena's mind is already twisting, searching the shadows for a softer story to justify the man keeping them alive. The long drive upstate is suffocating. For 3 hours, the silence in the car is thick enough to choke on. Marco won't stop tapping his fingers against his leg, a frantic, rhythmic attempt to shake off the terror still burning in his blood. True healing is never a peaceful, beautiful thing. It almost always begins as a frantic, uncomfortable vibration just beneath the surface of your skin. The wooden cabin upstate hits them like a physical blow, going from the violent noise of the city to the heavy, ringing silence of the woods forces their exhausted bodies into a painful withdrawal. Luca drops a cheap burner phone on the table, their only lifeline, strictly reserved for emergencies. It is a brilliant, cruel way to remind them exactly who holds the leash. When Marco tries to ask a question, Luca's eyes remain completely dead, a testament to Victor's chilling training. The door clicks shut, leaving them buried in a quiet they are not equipped to survive. There is a harsh lesson hiding in that dark wood. Stripping away the noise of the world doesn't bring you peace. It just forces you to finally hear your own screaming thoughts. Alone in the suffocating quiet, the massive emotional canyon between the brother and sister finally cracks wide open. Marco locks himself in the shower, desperate to scrub away the dirt and the deep, lingering humiliation of needing to be rescued. Out in the main room, Elena's body finally crashes. The sharp, hot agony of her broken arm is the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She doesn't reach for painkillers. She needs the sharp bite of reality to stay awake. You can see her staring at the single name saved in that burner phone, Victor. Her mind is already building a dangerous reliance on the very man who broke her world. The human mind is a tragically fragile instrument, so easily rewired by the desperate, clawing need to simply survive another day. Sitting in the dim light, Elena catches herself wondering if a monster like Victor ever actually closes his eyes to sleep. When Marco finally walks out of the bathroom, he looks 10 years younger, temporarily washed clean of the blood and the heavy chains of his addiction. He looks at the perfectly stocked kitchen and realizes Victor's obsession with control reaches into every single detail of their lives. Marco drops into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Completely crushed by the weight of his own failures, he had chased the addict's ultimate lie, the belief that one last wild gamble would somehow erase a lifetime of bad choices. The tragedy of addiction is universal, teaching us that the broken brain will always promise salvation right before it hands you a shovel. Let us look at this frame by frame, you and I. The camera lingers on Marco, a man hollowed out by a complete loss of identity. He sat in the dim light, confessing how his captors stripped away his morality, forcing his hands into unforgivable acts. When a soul is broken under that kind of terror, the person you used to be simply dies. Elena sat beside him, the shadows deepening the irreversible fracture in her own mind. They gripped each other's hands, anchoring to the only other ghost in the room. The days that followed were washed in muted grays, a suspended animation of empty routines. They moved like sleepwalkers, clinging to small habits just to survive. Because sometimes, when your entire world shatters into dust, building a quiet, simple routine is the only way to hold the pieces together. The lens shifts outside, where the sharp crack of an axe splits the cold air. Marco chopped wood until his hands bled, desperate to burn off the adrenaline and force his racing heart into a flat line. Inside, Elena stared blankly at a paperback, letting the pages blur to keep the terrifying memories at bay. But the night always brought Marco's demons out to play. His screams tore through the dark cabin, a brutal release of the horrors he buried. During the day, they never spoke of the night terrors. They just pretended the silence was safe. Then, on the fourth day, the heavy black phone rang. Elena snatched it up instantly. On the other end, Victor's voice was like ice, coldly checking on his broken toys. It is a hard truth of life. Avoiding your pain never cures it. It only gives the darkness a quiet place to grow. You and I have probably both made this mistake, smiling and saying, "We are fine," while our chest caves in. Victor saw right through her fragile lie, demanding the ugly truth. Her voice trembled as she confessed to jumping at every floorboard creak, waiting for the sky to fall. Victor bathed her in a chilling promise of absolute safety, his God complex filling the room. He described tearing down their enemy, Volkov, with the cold precision of an architect watching a building collapse exactly as planned. Yet, just for a second, his iron certainty slipped. A single flaw remained in his grand design. Dmitry Kozlov was nowhere to be. And, as we all eventually learn, the most dangerous threat in life is never the one standing in front of you, but the quiet shadow waiting in your blind spot. Let us step back and really look at Victor D'Angelo together. The camera focuses tight on the terrifying architecture of a man who owns people and the woman drowning in his orbit. Notice his careful control. He orders Elena to stay in the cabin, wrapping his dominance in the warm disguise of protection. Her stomach knots up, the instinctual dread of prey near a predator. He asks about her broken arm, his tone dripping with false care, merely checking the condition of a prized possession. He demands absolute obedience, and she quietly surrenders. The faint, metallic sounds of his violent world echo through the receiver before he suddenly hangs up. He leaves her with dead air, teaching us that the cruelest manipulators know exactly how to make you starve for their attention. The dial tone hums softly into the cold evening air. Elena stood frozen on the dim porch, clutching the plastic phone, her mind twisting itself into knots to defend a monster. She desperately painted his calculated grip as a warm embrace. Needing to believe his promise of safety was born of love, not possession. Later at the dinner table, the yellow kitchen light catches the deep furrow of Marco's brow. He instantly read the shift in his sister's eyes. When she whispered that Victor had called to check on them, Marco's posture turned to stone. He slammed his fork down, his voice sharp with terror. He reminded her what kind of predator they were dealing with. It is a painful lesson we often ignore. People who view the world as a transaction will never offer you something for nothing. The tension in the tiny kitchen was suffocating as Marco ripped away her comfortable lies. He knew exactly how men of violence operated in the shadows. He leaned across the table, his eyes wide with warning, and told her that men like Victor do not rescue strays. They collect them. It was the absolute truth about a man who hoarded human souls like trophies. Elena's chest tightened, her breathing shallow, as she fiercely protected the invisible chains binding her. She fired back that Marco did not know Victor. Marco's face fell, broken by the tragedy of her delusion, replying that she did not know him either. She praised the monster for keeping them breathing, blind to her own cage. True freedom is not just surviving. It is refusing to fall in love with the person holding the keys to your cell. Marco shattered the illusion, pointing at the locked doors and drawn curtains. They were hiding in the woods, holding their breath until a mob boss gave them permission to live. Elena looked away, defeated by the heavy, undeniable truth. That night, the darkness offered no peace. The camera pushes in as she stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind violently spinning. Was this cabin just a prettier cage than the bloody basement they barely escaped? She touched her healing arm, mistaking a tyrant's obsessive control for pure love. At 2 a.m, the heavy silence drove her out of bed. She sat alone in the freezing kitchen, trembling fingers tracing the dark screen of the phone. We must always be careful, for loneliness can easily trick us into missing the very things that broke us. What words could she possibly offer the devil? Her thoughts bled together, painfully torn between a sick sense of gratitude and the horrifying weight of needing him. She slowly pulled her hand away, leaving the phone on the table. Outside the frosted glass, a long shadow dragged across the tree line. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She hurried to the door, checking the heavy iron locks in a desperate, empty ritual of comfort. 2 agonizing days bled by before the phone finally buzzed. Victor's voice cut through the air, sharp as a straight razor. He revealed that Kozlov, the phantom hunting them, was loose in Brooklyn and searching for Marco. Victor delivered the terror perfectly. A harsh reminder that relying entirely on someone else for your safety is just another form of absolute surrender. There was a heavy, calculated silence on the line. Victor let the fear marinate before whispering that Kozlov did not know about her. He expertly placed himself as the only wall, standing between her and a shallow grave. He ordered her to stay frozen, to be a good girl while he handled the business. When she weakly asked what he planned to do, his long silence was a masterclass in quiet terror. He promised to erase the problem, his voice utterly devoid of human warmth. For a fleeting second, Elena wanted to beg him not to spill more blood, but the deep, ugly instinct to survive drowned out her fading morality. She closed her eyes and softly told the wolf to be careful. It is a tragic truth that when pushed to the edge of survival, our morals are often the very first things we abandon. Stick with me. This is where the true tragedy takes hold. Victor dropped his voice to a low, velvet rumble, perfectly faking a moment of intimate warmth. He promised her he was always careful, then let the line go dead. Standing in the pale light of the kitchen, Elena felt something sickening shift inside her chest. She was genuinely terrified, not for her own fragile life, but for the ruthless killer holding her leash. She was pouring her own soft heart into a hollow shell. When Marco found her staring blankly at the dark trees, she told him the hunter was closing in. Marco's eyes went wide with pure panic, screaming that they were just disposable bait. Elena spun around, her face flushed with fury, viciously defending the monster. "We fight hardest to defend the lies we need the most." Marco backed away, his hands trembling as logic fought her madness. He begged her to see the truth, asking what would happen the second Victor decided they were no longer useful. Elena stepped right into Marco's space, her eyes flashing with a dark, borrowed anger. She whispered that Victor was an honest man, totally blind to the invisible strings making her dance. She fiercely demanded her brother bow his head and be grateful to the warden keeping them locked away. Marco's jaw tightened, the camera catching the sheer heartbreak in his eyes as he watched his sister slip away into the dark. He looked at her, his voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. He told her she was falling in love with her captor. The hardest thing to watch is someone actively building their own ruin. The words hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Marco stood his ground, tears shining in his eyes, warning her that this twisted romance would burn her to ashes. He turned and walked away, leaving her stranded in the cold wind, her mind desperately screaming to reject his warning. She paced the boards, whispering to herself that Victor was a monster, a man of pure violence. But her wildly racing heart proved her a liar. Then came the cruelest punishment of all, total silence. Victor cut the wire. The phone stayed dead for days. It is a harsh lesson in human nature. Silence can be a weapon sharper than any knife, meant to starve you until you beg for a single drop of water. By the time the black sedan crawled up the gravel driveway, bringing Luca to her door, she was completely broken. We are about to uncover how the final trap springs shut. The afternoon sun was pale when Luca's heavy black car crunched to a halt. His face was a mask of dead stone, offering absolutely nothing to the trembling woman. He opened the door, quietly stating the boss wanted to see her. The bottom fell out of Elena's stomach, a sickening wave of pure dread. She looked back and asked about Marco. Luca cut the last thread of her family without a blink, ordering her brother to stay put. Marco stood framed in the doorway, his chest heaving with silent, helpless terror against a man holding all the cards. Elena did not scream. She did not fight. She simply got in the dark car. It teaches us that true control is not achieved by force, but by convincing the prisoner to quietly lock their own cage. The long drive back to the city was an exercise in slow torture. Luca drove in dead silence, letting the blur of bare trees fuel the darkest nightmares spinning in Elena's mind. Stepping out of the elevator into the penthouse felt like walking back into a beautiful tomb. It was the exact spot where Victor had first wrapped his hands around her shattered arm. The cold marble and soaring ceilings screamed of untouchable wealth and absolute dominance. Victor stood by the massive glass wall, looking out over the city like a dark god claiming his kingdom. He turned slowly, locking his terrifying, magnetic eyes onto hers. Without a single trace of emotion, he whispered that Kozlov was dead. We must remember, trusting a killer to save you is simply trading one executioner for another. The camera lingers on Victor's face, a mask of sculpted stone bathed in cold office light. He details the fatal consequence of Kozlov's mistake without a single blink. Elena's voice trembles as she asks if the kill is confirmed, and Victor offers a single, heavy nod. Today, you and I are going to unpack this tragedy together, watching the exact frame where a woman's morality shatters. She is torn between the horror of spilled blood and a desperate gratitude that she is still breathing. Sometimes survival demands we abandon our very souls. Victor shifts his weight, his leather shoes groaning softly as he leans against the mahogany desk. He looms in the shadows, asking if she plans to run or stay. Elena, her eyes wide and entirely lost, whispers that she just does not know. We freeze the frame right here. This is the moment the devil plays his most agonizing chord. Victor calmly validates every ounce of Marco's frantic paranoia. He admits with the sterile tone of a surgeon that he must control every breathing asset in his territory. Yet, he masterfully crafts a delicate illusion just for Elena, whispering that he has no desire to control her. It is a terrifying manipulation. He paints her absolute surrender as an act of free will, offering an open door he knows her shattered heart will never let her ever learn is that the most dangerous prisons are the ones with open doors. He steps so close she can smell the gunpowder and expensive cologne, invading her personal space to demand her total, unquestioning trust. Her breath hitches as she asks what exactly he needs from her. His answer is a dark, suffocating blanket of entitlement. She must become whatever he requires. Anyone not blinded by trauma would hear the deafening alarm bells run for their life. But her spirit is already entangled in his web. She feels a morbid, tragic pull toward the very monster who burned a city to the ground just to keep her. We often fall in love with the fire that is destined to burn us to ashes. She wants to see beneath his cold, unyielding mask. When she whispers her promise to stay, a shadow of triumph flickers in Victor's dark eyes. The predator has closed the cage. Without missing a beat, he pulls her from the sidelines and drops a heavy, leather-bound folder right into her trembling hands. You are smart, observant. You see things others miss, he tells her, his voice a low hum. I need someone I can trust for the parts of my business that need a softer touch. Let us look at this piece by piece. Watch how he perfectly isolates her from reality. Elena opens the folder, pages rustling in the quiet room. I do not understand, she breathes. Victor explains his shift toward real estate and clean money. He needs fresh blood, someone who will not fight his evolution. You want me to manage your legal businesses? She asks, barely a whisper. I want you to help me build something that lasts, he replies. True power never shouts. It whispers until you willingly lean in to listen. His steady tone wraps around her like a velvet tranquilizer, subduing her mind entirely. Something that does not require blood to maintain, he adds, painting a fantasy of a clean kingdom. Elena simply stares, the light catching a faint tear in her eye. Why me? She asks. Because you are not afraid of me, he replies. A ghost of a smile touches his lips, expertly stroking her bruised ego. And because you have every reason to walk away, yet you choose to stay. She looks at the floor. What about Marco? Victor promises to protect her brother with clean work, provided there are no more gambling mistakes. He will not like being watched, she warns. He will like being alive. Victor shoots back. Life teaches us, Is, that the highest price we ever pay is for safety. He wraps her total enslavement in the comforting blanket of a secure future, and she helplessly sinks into it. In exchange, you work for me, you trust me, and you do not look back. The blade falls, severing her ties to her former life. The camera captures her inner panic. She is just a maid, untrained to run a shadow empire. But the lonely heart fears invisibility more than danger, and Victor plays on that starvation flawlessly. Okay, she breathes. I am in. Victor holds gaze, his eyes unreadable before extending a hand. When she takes it, his iron grip seals her tragic fate. Welcome to the family, he says. Just like that, the innocent girl dies, and a new creature is born. Later, as Luca drives her back to the isolated cabin, the heavy dossier rests on her lap like a ticking bomb. Her fingers trace the leather, her mind spiraling into a dark, irreversible future. We watch her step over the threshold, no longer a victim, but an active player in her own demise. Marco paces the cabin floorboards. "Where were you?" he demands. "The city," Elena replies softly, setting the heavy folder on the table. Marco's face drops, the shadows in the room swallowing him whole as she explains the job offer of managing clean money. "And you said yes," Marco spits out, letting out a laugh that sounds like breaking glass. "Of course you did." Elena pleads with him to understand, but Marco is already spiraling. This is how it starts. He yells, his hands trembling. "He makes you feel important, like you matter. Even a broken man sees the truth sometimes." Marco recognizes the deadly trap of a predator's grooming, helpless as his sister walks right into the jaws of the beast. "And then you owe him, and then you cannot leave," Marco cries. The next words fall from Elena's lips so naturally it breaks the heart. "I do not want to leave." Marco freezes, the air leaving his lungs. "He saved your life. He is giving us a future." Marco's face crumples, tears brimming in his red eyes as his voice cracks in pure agony. "Because I do not want to lose you to him, Ellie." She reaches out, touching his arm to comfort her grieving brother. "You are not losing me," she whispers. But Marco knows better. He asks the fatal question. What happens when Victor asks her to do the unforgivable? He is not going to, she insists, building a heavy fortress of denial. The truest tragedy in life is watching someone you love willingly pull a dark blindfold over their own eyes. "You do not know that," Marco pleads. "I do," Elena fires back. She claims she is choosing this freely, blind to the fact that her free will is just another string pulled by the puppet master. Marco recoils from her touch, shaking his head in deep mourning. "Then you are already gone," he whispers, shutting his door with a devastating click. Over the next few days, the silence in the cabin becomes a suffocating fog. They are ghosts haunting the same rooms. Marco turns his inner torment outward, punishing himself by chopping wood until his bare hands are raw and blistered. Elena watches the blood on his palms, but does absolutely nothing. Love requires tending, and she has allowed their bond to wither in the cold. The slow, agonizing death of their family has officially begun. Stick with me here, because her transformation is terrifying to witness. To escape the guilt of her shattered family, Elena buries herself in Victor's empire. The black dossier becomes her only lifeline. She spreads the pages across the wooden table, tracing her fingers over sanitized portfolios and shadowy import operations. All the hyper-awareness she once used to survive abusive men is now laser-focused on finding the lies hidden in the ink. She learns to read ledgers the way a cornered animal reads a room for exits. By the fourth night in the dark cabin, she finally picks up the phone, taking his bait completely. "I have questions," she tells him into the receiver. On the other end, Victor's voice is low, steady, and utterly victorious. "Go ahead," he commands softly. "We have to look closely at the invisible ropes binding them during this call. The warehouse in Red Hook, under Meridian Holdings, that is not legitimate, is it?" Elena asks. Victor's voice comes through the speaker, smooth as glass. "It was used for storage. Nothing illegal." She presses harder, citing the previous tenant's mob connections. "I terminated the lease," he states calmly. "And the new tenant?" she asks. "Has not been decided yet. That is your job." The camera zeroes in as Elena's breath catches, a sickening thrill twisting in her gut. He wants her to build something profitable, something completely quiet. He asks if she has ideas. Without missing a beat, her mind races to optimize the dark waterfront access. The steel cage is fully locked, and she is happily decorating the bars. "I need to see it in person," she demands softly. Victor agrees instantly, sending Luca tomorrow. Her eyes drift toward Marco's closed bedroom door. "What about Marco? He is not handling this well." Victor's reply is a slice of pure ice. "He is handling it better than a week ago. He will adjust." Elena grips the phone tightly. "And if he does not?" Victor's silence is heavy. "Then he will have to decide if he wants to survive or if he wants to be right." He whispers that she cannot save someone who refuses salvation. "You and I have probably made this mistake, confusing a prison for a sanctuary." In that exact moment, the crushing truth finally breaks her. She has spent a lifetime bleeding to cover her brother's endless sins, and she realizes it was all for absolutely nothing. Marco always found a new, tragic way to fall. "I know," Elena whispers, her voice devoid of life. Victor tells her to sleep, promising Luca at 9 before the line clicks dead. The camera finds her alone in the pitch-black kitchen, moonlight painting shadows across the documents. Her face is utterly blank, the empathy for her own flesh and blood draining away. At 9 o'clock sharp, Luca's black sedan idles in the driveway. Elena slips into the car without a single word. As they speed away from the quiet woods and plunge into the concrete canyons of the city, we witness the shedding of her human skin. The old Elena is gone. She stands before the massive red brick warehouse, her cold eyes tracing the sorry ceilings, fully ready to mold this dark empire into her own beautiful nightmare. The heavy iron door groans open. Dust motes dance in the slanted shafts of pale afternoon light, illuminating the cracked concrete of a cavernous warehouse. Elena steps through the threshold, her eyes scanning the shadows like a predator mapping a newly claimed territory. She visualizes affluent buyers paying premiums for exposed brick and willful ignorance. "What was stored here before?" she asks. Luca leans against the doorframe, bathed in shadow, a picture of absolute detachment. Electronics, imported goods, nothing that will come back to bite us, he answers smoothly. His denial is flawless, a masterclass in rehearsed innocence. "But you and I both know that every empty room holds a ghost. We often paint over our darkest histories, but the foundation always remembers what was buried there." "And Volkov?" Elena presses. Luca's features remain an absolute void of emotion. Never owned it. "Just connections," he murmurs. The camera lingers on Elena as she ignores the throbbing ache radiating from her heavy plaster cast, raising her device to measure the echoing space. Ambition is a powerful anesthetic. "You know what you are doing?" Luca asks, a muscle twitching near his jaw. "Not really, but I am learning." Luca smiles, a grim shadow of absolute devotion. "Boss has good instincts. He saved my life 8 years ago, pulled me out of a street war in Queens when I should have died. It is a tragic truth we all face. The deepest loyalties are almost always forged in the fires of our worst traumas. Listen closely to the rhythm of his surrender. Boss gave me a choice," Luca says, his voice a low, steady hum in the vast emptiness. "Work for him or take my chances. I chose him. Never regretted it." Elena watches the subtle tension in his shoulders. "You ever question what he does?" Luca pushes off the frame, stepping into the fading light. "Every day. But questioning does not mean leaving. It means understanding the cost and paying it." They spend another hour in the dust, Elena's mind racing with the intoxicating high of creation. Later, the black sedan glides through the neon-soaked streets, pulling up to the towering penthouse instead of her cabin. She does not fight it. We often surrender our freedom for a sense of belonging, mistaking a beautiful cage for a sanctuary. The mahogany doors close with a muffled thud, sealing Elena inside Victor's domain. He stands by the glass, finishing a sharp phone call in rapid Italian. Without a word, he gestures for her to sit, the air heavy with his quiet dominance. "How is the warehouse?" he asks, city lights reflecting in his cold eyes. "Good bones. Needs work, but salvageable." Elena replies, sliding the tablet across the desk. "High-end residential lofts. 6 months for permits and renovations." She wraps her ambition in cold, clinical words, desperate for approval from the predator before her. Sometimes, in our desperate search for validation, we eagerly hand the tools of our own destruction to the people who hold the power. Come with me, and let us watch a master manipulator at work. The tension in the room is suffocating, vibrating against the glass walls. Elena lays out the discrepancies at Apex Global, pointing out the missing funds. Victor does not flinch. Instead, a slow, terrifying smile spreads across his face, like a shadow creeping over a gravestone. He already knew about the stolen money. This was never a meeting. It was an audition. Elena's breath catches, her chest tightening as the awful reality settles over her. She is not a partner, but a pawn on his board. It is a harsh lesson to learn, but true power rarely reveals its hand until the trap is already sprung. We must always remember that the people who demand our blind trust are often the ones who secretly deserve it the least. The camera holds on Victor's emotionless gaze. In his world, you are either a useful tool or you are erased. His voice drops into a flat, casual drawl that chills the blood. He tells her she passed the test simply because she survived it, and orders her to hunt down the thief quietly. The shift in the atmosphere is violent and immediate. Elena's hands tremble slightly as she asks, "What will happen to the man who stole from him?" Victor's silence is louder than any threat, a cold promise of absolute ruin. Yet, despite the terror freezing her veins, she does not run. She remains in his penthouse as the city sleeps below. We often mistake danger for excitement, staying in rooms that are quietly burning down just to feel the warmth of the fire. The guest room is a glass cage, suspended high above the sprawling city. Elena presses her forehead against the cold pane, the silence ringing in her ears. She is completely cut off, her mind spinning with guilt over Marco's inevitable anger. Then, the door clicks open. Victor steps out of the shadows. His tie is gone, his sleeves rolled up, his hair messy. It is a perfectly staged performance of exhaustion, designed to bypass her defenses and strike directly at her empathy. When he asks her to walk with him, his voice is soft, almost fragile. But make no mistake, it is an absolute command draped in velvet. It is funny how easily we are manipulated by a small show of weakness, forgetting that a wounded wolf still possesses teeth capable of tearing us apart. The biting wind whips across the terrace, howling through the steel and glass. Victor steps close to the edge, forcing Elena to face the freezing drop. He does not look at her when he speaks. His voice cuts cleanly through the howling wind, striking straight at Marco. He predicts her brother will break, that Marco will bend the knee to this new empire simply out of fear and blind devotion. Elena grips the frozen metal railing, her knuckles turning white. Victor turns his head, his eyes empty, quietly planting the seed that she might have to cut Marco loose forever. We cling so desperately to the people we love, but sometimes the heaviest anchors dragging us into the dark are the very hands we refuse to let go of. Let us pause and look at the sheer cruelty of this moment. The darkness seems to wrap around Victor as he speaks of his dead sister. His tone is entirely hollow, devoid of a single tear or crack of grief. He describes the blood, the chaotic street corner, the pathetic dealer she died trying to protect. He is weaving a beautiful, tragic illusion, turning himself from a monster into a grieving protector in Elena's eyes. It is a calculated strike at her heart, drawing a terrifying parallel to her own brother. This is the danger of shared pain. We are so eager to find common ground in suffering that we often fail to see when someone is using their tragic history to sharpen the blade they plan to use against us. He died in a gutter with a needle in his arm. Victor whispered into the wind, his face a mask of carved stone. The tragic story instantly hardens into a merciless weapon. He steps closer, his shadow falling completely over her, and commands her to drop her brother before he drags her down into the dirt. A violent shudder rips through Elena's body. Her throat tightens, suffocated by the sudden, horrifying realization that he is right. Years of lying, paying off debts, and hiding Marco's sins flash behind her eyes. Victor is systematically burning her old world to the ground. Change is often agonizing, and the most painful part of outgrowing our past is realizing that the people we swore to protect are the ones holding us back. You can almost see the heavy gears turning behind Elena's eyes as she swallows his poison. The camera catches the slight tremor in her breath. When she whispers a question about his motives, Victor performs a masterful illusion. A flicker of deep, profound sadness crosses his face. "I just do not want to see you make my mistake," he says softly. In that heavy, breathless silence, the trap snaps shut. She no longer sees a criminal kingpin. She sees a broken man trying to save her. When the morning sun finally breaks over the horizon, bleeding red across the sky, she returns to the quiet cabin, a completely different woman. We so desperately want to heal the broken souls around us. We rarely notice when they start breaking us in return. Stick with me here, because the morning light back at the cabin is harsh and unforgiving. Marco stands frozen by the kitchen sink, his shoulders pulled tight, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. When Elena quietly confesses that she stayed the night at the penthouse, a muscle violently jumps in his jaw. The silence stretches, thick with unspoken terror. But instead of screaming, instead of running, his hands shake as he turns and pours her a cup of black coffee. It is the tragic, heartbreaking surrender of a man who knows he is outmatched. He swallows his raw fear of the predator simply to stay close to his sister. Fear makes us do terrible things, but the absolute terror of being left behind will make a man willingly walk into his own grave. The camera lingers on Marco's trembling hands as they clutch his sister's sleeves. He whispers his deepest fears into the heavy silence of the room and completely surrendering his spirit. He is terrified of being left behind in the dark. Elena holds him tight, but her eyes are distant, cold, and shadowed. When she speaks, promising him that no harm will come to them, her voice carries a terrifying echo. She uses the exact words, the precise, measured cadence of Victor. It is a quiet tragedy playing out in real time. She is absorbing the monster's dominance just to keep her brother calm. You and I know how this works, do we not? Sometimes, the only way to protect the people we love is by making promises we can never keep, turning ourselves into something ruthless just to survive. Over the next 2 weeks, the pale glow of the monitor is the only light touching Elena's face. She uses the endless columns of financial records as a shield against her own fading conscience. If she just focuses on the math, she does not have to think about the blood. She traces a hidden leak in the Empire's vault, narrowing the list of thieves down to 3 names, 2 managers, 1 accountant. It is terrifying to watch how naturally she adapts to the dark. The frightened civilian is gone, replaced by a perfectly tuned instrument of the kingpin. When she slides that final report across the polished mahogany of Victor's desk, she crosses a line she can never walk back from. The sad reality of life is this: if you force yourself to play in the mud long enough, you eventually forget what it ever felt like to be clean. Listen to the absolute lack of emotion in her voice as she speaks. Elena stands tall, eliminating the accountant right away because his numbers are too neat. She points a steady finger at two men, Martin Chen and David Rossi. She maps out their sins with brutal clarity. Chen bought a luxury car, ate at high-end restaurants, and flew across Europe on a modest wage. Rossi, however, lived a quiet, disciplined life. Yet Elena is dangerously sharp now. She notes that Rossi's perfection might just be a deeper mask. Victor sits in the shadows, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. He absorbs her words like a machine processing fatal commands. Intelligence without empathy is a dangerously sharp weapon. When a person stops seeing others as humans and starts treating them as puzzles, they lose a piece of their own soul. You and I are going to look at this moment together, because this is where the trap snaps shut. Victor casually mentions he will talk to Chen. He paints a picture of grace, claiming the man will return the money and walk away. But the heavy, suffocating silence that follows tells a fatal story. Elena's breath catches, a sickening knot twisting in her stomach. She knew the rules, but handing a man over to an executioner is tearing her mind apart. Victor watches her fracture in real time. He leans forward, his voice dropping to a smooth, soothing whisper, telling her the blood is not on her hands. Here is a difficult life lesson. The most dangerous lies are never the ones our enemies tell us. They are the quiet, comforting lies we choose to accept just so we can fall asleep at night. Victor masterfully tries to build a wall in her mind. He works to separate her data analysis from the brutal violence that will soon follow, placing all the blame on Chen's greed. He offers her a tempting escape from guilt. She wants so desperately to believe him, to draw a line between her spreadsheets and a man's life. But her soul fights back. The crushing weight of her actions suffocates her. She gasps for air, fleeing out onto the cold stone terrace. Her hands grip the iron railing as a severe panic attack hits her, chest heaving under the pale moonlight. The glittering city below does not care about the tragic collapse of her morality. It is a harsh and universal truth. The world will never stop spinning just because our hearts are breaking, and our choices always carry a terrible weight. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Elena closes her eyes and pictures Martin Chen, a man unaware his doom is sealed, knowing she is the one who sealed it. Victor glides onto the terrace, movements impossibly smooth, hands casually in his pockets. He watches her drown in guilt and calls it the natural point of gaining power. He offers her a choice: embrace the violence or walk away. But a predator never actually leaves the cage door open. He is simply manipulating her into choosing her own damnation. He warns her this is the point of no return. The innocence she loses tonight can never be found again. Life presents us with these quiet crossroads. When a person finally chooses to step into the dark, they must leave the light behind. There are no half measures in the death of a soul. Let us examine this tragic internal war. Elena stands torn between the quiet safety of her brother Mark and the terrifying, magnetic pull of Victor. The monster has fed her starving ego, making her feel utterly irreplaceable. "I am not going anywhere," she whispers, sealing her own fate. A brief flicker of triumph flashes in Victor's eyes, the satisfaction of a hunter claiming his prize. "Good," he murmurs. In the heavy silence, he offers her a seat at the upcoming execution. He tells her Chen is coming tomorrow, and she can be there if she wishes. Her heart races, sick and thrilled all at once. The lesson here is deeply tragic. Ordinary safety rarely competes with the dark, seductive thrill of being truly seen, even if the eyes watching you happen to belong to a ruthless predator. Going to this meeting means Elena must finally watch her savior turn into a ruthless executioner. But her mind has already built thick walls to protect her. "I will be there," she breathes, fully stepping into his dark world. Victor gives a slow nod, eager to break his victim under the lights. The stage is set in a private, windowless room inside a high-end restaurant Victor owns. Elena arrives shivering, her nerves wired raw. Luca, the scarred enforcer, who is just as trapped in this web as she is, stands guard. Boss is in the back. "You ready for this?" he mutters, voice thick with sorrow. When she confesses her terror, Luca offers a tragic smile. "Good. Means you are not a sociopath. Fear is not always a weakness. Sometimes, the raw terror felt in the face of cruelty proves a person still has a soul." Luca pushes the great lie of the underworld onto her. "Just remember, whatever happens, Chen brought it on himself. Blaming the doomed man is the only way they survive their own guilt." Elena steps into the dead silence of the dimly lit room. Victor waits in the corner shadows, a glass of dark liquor catching the faint light. He points to the chair beside him, claiming her as his property. "He will be here in 10 minutes, Victor says. Elena's hands shake as she rests her arm on the cold table. She asks what he plans to do, and Victor's voice is terrifyingly calm. "I am going to give him a chance to tell the truth." He paints his deadly trap as an act of mercy. If he lies, cowards do not get second chances. There is a profound danger in those who dress their cruelty in the noble garments of justice. Martin Chen walks through the heavy door. He is perfectly dressed, wearing a fragile mask of confidence to hide the terror underneath. He forces a bright smile. "Mr. D'Angelo, good to see you," but his eyes snap to Elena, realizing instantly that the script has changed. Victor's voice cuts through the air like a sudden blade. "Sit down, Martin." In 3 words, Chen's entire reality collapses. He sinks into the chair, his breath shallow as panic sets in. "Is something wrong?" he asks. Victor lets the heavy silence stretch, weaponizing the quiet, before sliding a folder across the mahogany wood. These are financial records. 6 months' worth. Chen turns the color of ash. "I do not understand," he chokes out. Guilt is a heavy ghost. A man can dress it up, but when the truth calls his name, the mask shatters. Victor dissects the theft like a surgeon opening a vein. Small amounts, consistent. Smart if you are patient, stupid if you think I will not notice. A violent tremble takes hold of Chen's hand, his body betraying his absolute terror. "You think it is me?" he gasps. Victor leans forward, his eyes dead and cold. "I know it is you. The question is whether you are going to admit it or insult my intelligence." The crushing weight of the silence completely breaks the man. "It was not supposed to go this far," Chen whispers. Elena watches with a heavy heart as Chen spills his pathetic story of bad debts, swearing he meant to put the money back. It is human nature to negotiate with past mistakes, pretending the unfixable can be repaired. But a lie told to cover up a betrayal is really just a shovel digging a much deeper grave. "I am sorry. I will pay it back, every cent, just please." The desperate begging begins, thick with tears. Victor sits like a statue of ice, entirely unmoved by the broken man weeping before him. "How much did you take?" he asks, though he already knows every single penny. 43,000, Chen sobs. Victor slowly repeats the number, letting it hang in the air like a noose. "You stole $43,000 from me for bad investments. Chen spirals into frantic panic, swearing he can fix it. You cannot, Victor whispers, severing his last thread of hope. You are done, Martin. Even when Chen cries out for his family, Victor feels nothing. He demands the money in 30 days, followed by permanent exile. True power never yells. It simply dictates the terms of your ruin. And in this life, there are debts that money alone can never truly repay. The sentence of exile hung in the dim room, absolute and final. If I see you again, if I even hear your name, you will not get a second warning. Chen stood trembling, tears spilling hot and fast. Understood, he choked out. He stumbled toward the door, shooting a look of humiliated venom at Elena. Picture this scene with me. Elena sat frozen. She had just helped dismantle a man's entire life. Victor, untouched by the wreckage, took a slow sip of his drink. I do not know, she whispered, answering his unspoken check on her state. That is honest, he murmured. He offered his hand. Sometimes the choices that damn us are the quietest ones. Slowly, her fingers met his, sealing her fate in his dark world, while Luca drifted behind them like a quiet ghost. You and I know that standing close to a fire leaves you with burns. Elena's mind played Chen's total collapse on a cruel loop. He is not going to pay you back, she said into the cool night air. Victor walked with measured confidence. Probably not, but he will try, he agreed smoothly. He casually mentioned that if Chen lingered, Luca would deliver a physical reminder. Elena stared straight ahead, refusing to picture the violence that implied. Beside the black sedan, Victor paused, the streetlights carving sharp angles on his face. You did good tonight. When she tried to brush off her role, he caught her gaze. You are stronger than you think, Elena. That quiet praise sank into her skin like a warm drug, binding her closer to the predator. She grabbed onto his words like a drowning woman, finding a rope, desperate to believe her fear was actually power. Thank you, she whispered. The heavy car door slammed shut, sealing her in the dark, quiet interior. As they drove, she watched the bright city lights blur and fade into the distance, a perfect reflection of her own fading morals. It is a tragic thing when the guilt of doing wrong is swallowed by the rush of feeling untouchable. Hours later, they reached the isolated cabin. Marco, her brother, was slumped on the dark porch. The bitter smell of cheap tobacco hung heavy in the damp air. He was smoking again. He had sworn to quit when they buried their mother. But blind panic always sends a fragile mind running right back to the very poisons that make it feel secure. You were gone a long time, Marco muttered from the shadows, his voice sharp with the anger of someone terrified of being abandoned. Elena sank onto the wooden steps, her bones aching as the adrenaline finally crashed. Victor had a meeting. He wanted me there, she said softly. She painted the grim picture of the terrified thief. Marco blew a thick cloud of smoke into the dark, waiting for the bloody punchline. Victor gave him a chance. He is leaving New York, she finished. Marco scoffed, his face twisting into a bitter sneer. That is it? No broken bones? No body in the river? Elena crossed her arms, entirely defensive. Marco let out a dark, hollow laugh that cut right through her ribs. You sound disappointed, he mocked. She stammered wrong, claiming it was just relief, but the cynic saw right through her. Marco flicked his cigarette, watching the embers die in the dirt. Eventually, he whispered harshly, Victor is going to ask you to do something that does not end clean, and you will have to decide if you can live with it. He was absolutely right. The grace period with a predator always ends when they ask you to hold the knife. Desperate to shift the narrative, Elena leaned forward. Victor offered you a job. Legitimate work. Good pay, real benefits. It was a brilliant trap, spying the unstable brother to keep the sister on a tight leash. Marco stared at her, his chronic anxiety warring against his desperate need for money. "What kind of property?" he finally mumbled, suspicion heavy in his eyes. She rattled off the mundane details of a midtown office, trying to make the cage sound like a sanctuary. "Let us examine Marco's next move together." He leaned back, testing the boundaries. "And if I say no?" Elena kept her face blank, masking her panic. "Then you say no, but you would be an idiot to turn it down." Marco crushed his cigarette under his boot. "You really trust him, do you not?" When she gave a slow nod, Marco went straight for the wound. "Why? Because he saved my life, or because he makes you feel important?" The truth felt like a physical slap. She turned to flee the mirror he was holding up, but hesitated. The real tragedy of a broken heart is how eagerly it accepts a beautiful lie. "Because he is the first person who has ever kept a promise to me," she whispered. She believed the predator was her savior, utterly blind to the fact that she was just being sharpened for his use. "He sees potential," she pleaded, gripping the twisted reflection Victor had handed her. "Maybe I am walking into something I do not understand, but at least I am walking forward instead of standing still." The words shattered Marco's fragile pride. He whined about the unfairness of it all, his shoulders slumping. But Elena was finally done carrying his weight. She stared at him with cold, clear pity. "I love you, Marco, but you have been running from consequences your entire life, and I've been cleaning up behind you." She would rather walk into a gilded trap than rot in the misery of pure survival. Leaving her brother completely broken on the dark porch, she retreated inside. She shut her bedroom door and leaned against it, her chest heaving, her pulse hammering wildly as the reality of severing her only family tie set in. For years, she had buried the exhaustion of loving someone who constantly destroyed himself. Just as that realization hit her, the quiet room was pierced by her phone. A text from Victor, a perfectly timed pull on his invisible leash. "You made it back okay?" She typed out a frantic reply, confessing Marco's dark suspicions. His response revealed his quiet, commanding control. Questions are better than silence. When she relayed Marco's ultimate fear, that Victor would push her past the point of no return, his answer made the air in the room turn to ice. He is probably right. The most dangerous monsters are the ones who refuse to hide their teeth. By openly admitting his darkness, he shattered her defenses. When she asked, her fingers trembling over the glass screen, what would happen if she failed his dark tests, his command was absolute. "Just tell me. Stick with me here, because this is where the cracks really show, and we figure out another way." Elena whispered to the room. She let out a shaky breath, closing her eyes to force the ugly truth back down. She curled up in the shadows of the bed, desperate to hide. Outside, Marco had not moved. The slow, tortured creak of his wooden chair and the sharp flick of his lighter echoed in the dark. He was a man drowning in his own mind, waiting as the dawn bled over the horizon. The next day, before the hot coffee even touched her lips, her phone rang. "Victor, we have a problem." His voice came through, low, cold, and entirely stripped of warmth. Elena felt the floor drop out from beneath her, a heavy, sick dread pooling in her stomach. "What kind of problem?" she breathed, her voice trembling like a trapped animal. Victor delivered the news like a coroner reading a chart. David Rossi, the manager she had put a target on, was completely gone. No show at his shift, his apartment empty, every phone line dead. Either he ran or someone got to him, Victor stated. He laid out the grim reality with absolute calm. Elena's heart raced, slamming violently against her ribs. Before she could even process the danger, Victor pulled the net tight. Rossi running was proof of his theft, and Victor needed her at the city office immediately. He needed her brilliant mind to trace the bleeding money before Rossi vanished forever. Across the small kitchen, Marco sat hunched over the peeling table. His eyes, rimmed dark red from a sleepless night, tracked her every single movement. Let's pause and watch what happens right here. I will be there in 2 hours, Elena finally agreed. Victor smoothly noted that Luca was already on his way, a terrifying reminder that she was never out of his sight. She lowered the phone and looked at Marco. She quietly explained that Rossi had vanished, and she was ordered to hunt down the money. She stood up, physically surrendering to Victor's will. But Marco stood up too, blocking her path. I am coming with you, he stated firmly. It was a stunning shift. The fearful brother was suddenly planting his feet. You keep telling me to stop being useless, he snapped, his jaw tight, hands balled into fists. He refused to be pushed aside again. The raw, desperate certainty in his tone was something she had not heard from him in years. You are my sister, Marco said, his voice thick with fierce loyalty. He refused to let her walk into a cage of wolves alone. Elena stared at him, torn entirely in two. Every instinct screamed to leave him safely behind, but a terrified part of her desperately wanted him there. Maybe he needed to see the real Victor to finally understand the dark world she was trapped in. Okay, she breathed, demanding he stay silent and follow her lead. Luca arrived precisely on time. When he saw Marco standing in the dirt driveway, not a single muscle in the enforcer's cold face twitched. He simply opened the heavy rear door, playing the quiet ferryman to the underworld. The long drive back to the city was suffocating. Marco stared blankly out the tinted window, his knee bouncing in a rapid, uncontrollable tremor of pure terror. Inside the dark sedan, Elena's eyes stayed glued to her glowing screen, chasing ghosts in the digital ledgers. Rossi is smarter than Chen, she whispered, her voice trembling to anchor her rising panic. She needed him to be just a clever thief, but Marco shattered that illusion. Or he wasn't stealing at all, he murmured, suggesting Rossi was already dead, erased by unseen enemies. Up front, Luca's weary eyes caught hers in the mirror. The kid has a point, he rasped. Elena felt the air leave her lungs as her fragile defenses finally crumbled. She had been so focused on proving her own theories that she ignored the ruthless violence surrounding them. It shows you that sometimes our desperate need to be right completely blinds us to the fatal realities standing right beside us. Let us step together into the den of a true predator. High above Earth, Victor stood bathed in cold light, flanked by two heavy enforcers. They were living weapons waiting for an excuse to cause pain. With a flick of his wrist, Victor dismissed them. When Elena explained why Marco was there, Victor offered a chilling, empty smile. Family loyalty. I respect that, he said smoothly. But for a monster like him, loyalty is merely a chain to wrap around someone's neck. He pointed at the chairs, ordering them to sit. Turning his monitor, he revealed photographs of Rossi's apartment. It was completely destroyed. Someone else had arrived first, tearing the place to pieces. Elena leaned closer, her stomach twisting at the terrifying, violent wreckage displayed right in front of her. The bright screen illuminated the ruin of the apartment. Wood covered the floor, and drawers were ripped from their hinges. It was the brutal aftermath of a violent hunt. Marco swallowed hard, suggesting Rossi tore his place apart in a rush to pack. No, Victor replied, his voice colder than ice. This is someone searching, not someone packing. Victor clicked his mouse, pulling up Rossi's hidden bank records. 2 accounts were empty. The third showed a sudden deposit of $50,000 in untraceable cash. Elena forgot to breathe. Victor's dark eyes locked onto the screen. He knew instantly that Rossi had sold them out before someone permanently silenced him. It is a brutal truth of our world that dirty money will always demand the ultimate, terrible price. Marco's voice cracked as he asked the dreadful question, was Rossi dead? Victor did not blink. I think it is likely, he said, his tone stripped of warmth. A heavy silence filled the room. Elena squeezed her eyes shut as the weight of guilt slammed into her chest. Her data work had painted a bright red target on Rossi's back. Victor watched her crumble, stepping in like a spider, sensing a tremor in its web. This is not your fault, he whispered smoothly. He twisted the story, blaming Rossi's own greed for his brutal end, washing the blood off Elena's hands to pull her deeper into his dark world. He ordered her to trace the dirty money. The most dangerous manipulators will always offer a comforting lie right when the ugly truth threatens to completely break your spirit. You could see the dark gears grinding behind Victor's eyes as he mapped out his war plan. He bragged about his illegal access into global banks. Elena nervously asked the unthinkable. What if the rat was inside his own circle? Victor's voice dropped low. Then we will deal with it, he promised. For a dictator like him, defiance is a death sentence. Nobody challenges his grip and lives. Sitting nearby, Marco was a coiled spring, burning every terrifying detail into his memory, yet biting his tongue to survive. Victor barked into his phone in sharp Italian. Hanging up, he ordered Elena to rip apart Rossi's digital life over the last 6 months. It shows a harsh reality. Pure silence in the face of a true monster is often the absolute greatest survival instinct a person can possess. When Elena asked for the files, Victor tried to separate the suspects. He ordered Luca to take Elena, demanding Marco stay behind. No, Marco snapped, his voice tight but his posture unbending. He refused to leave his sister's side. Victor stared at him with the stillness of a shark. He let the heavy silence stretch before agreeing, as long as Marco kept his mouth shut. Marco swallowed his bitter pride, his jaw clenching hard. Soon, Luca drove them to a glass tower in the financial district, a sterile building hiding dark secrets. Inside a cold room, Luca dropped a mountain of heavy boxes onto the mahogany table. Victor's deep paranoia meant all vital records were strictly kept on hard paper. It proves that the terrible men who demand the most loyalty are always the very ones who trust absolutely no one. Let us look at this piece by piece together. Elena and Marco fell into a desperate rhythm. He shuffled through paper while she frantically typed, comparing the ink against her screen. The room felt like a tomb, hours slipping by in a blur. Then, Marco broke the heavy silence. His hand shook slightly as he slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a lease for a hidden storage unit in New Jersey, signed by Rossi 3 months ago. This place did not exist in Victor's books. Elena stared at the document. The unit was paid for by a phantom company using money totally hidden from the boss's eye. This is off the grid, she whispered, her blood turning to ice. It shows that sometimes the deadliest truths are buried right in plain sight, just waiting for someone to finally turn over the wrong stone. No, Victor would have mentioned it, Elena murmured, connecting the fatal dots. They had stumbled upon Rossi's secret vault, the exact spot where he hid his treason. Marco guessed Rossi was taking orders from a rival. Without hesitation, Elena dialed the boss himself. When she told Victor about the lease, the line went dead. Then his voice returned, cold as a razor. I am coming to you. The call clicked off. Marco looked at his sister, his face pale. He is pissed, he whispered, But Elena shook her head, frantically stuffing the papers into her bag. "He is focused," she corrected softly. "There is a massive difference between a man who has lost his temper and a cold predator who has finally caught the scent of blood." 30 minutes later, Victor walked through the glass doors, his dangerous muscle trailing right behind him. "Let us pause and look at what is happening here." Victor stared at the paper, his face a mask of ice. He quietly asked, "Who set up the fake company?" Elena named the lawyer, Anthony Greco. For a second, Victor's jaw locked tight. Luca stepped forward, explaining the danger. Greco belonged to the Vitalis family. They were ruthless rivals, moving into Victor's territory like hungry wolves. The picture became crystal clear. Rossi was not just stealing. He was a rat, feeding secrets directly to the enemy. That cash was his reward for pure treason. Victor's eyes went completely blank, his humanity shutting down to prepare for heavy violence. They were going to rip that storage unit open immediately. A person can only play both sides for so long before the dangerous middle finally crushes them into nothing. The black cars rolled into the night. Marco was wedged between two killers in the second vehicle, his face pale but his jaw locked in pride. They pulled into an empty industrial lot, perfect for burying terrible deeds. Victor grabbed heavy bolt cutters. With a vicious crunch, he severed the thick lock, tearing down Rossi's last defense. The metal door rolled up, revealing a room packed with boxes. Luca tore into the first one, pulling out thick folders. It was a roadmap of absolute betrayal, secret ledgers, photos, and hidden accounts. "Evidence?" Luca whispered. Rossi had built a paper bomb capable of destroying Victor's life. Victor looked calm, but you could feel the murderous heat radiating off his body. "We learn the hard way that the dark secrets we desperately try to hide are usually the exact things that finally destroy us." Let us look at the monster standing inside that storage unit. Victor's chilling narcissism was on full display in the shadows. He turned to Elena, his voice void of emotion, and explained that Rossi was preparing to sell their empire to the Vitalis family. When she asked why Rossi would do such a thing, Victor waved his hand, treating human desperation like useless trivia. Marco asked if the rival family had already killed the traitor. Victor shook his head. His mind was dangerously sharp. If the enemy had found him, this room would be empty. Rossi was not dead yet. He was hiding in terror. Victor stared right through Elena, making it clear that hunting the man down was simply a business requirement. It leaves us with a haunting truth. Men who demand absolute power will always view human life as a deeply cheap, completely disposable currency. The heavy weight of Victor's decree dropped over the room like a suffocating blanket. This was no longer a petty dispute over missing funds. It had violently shifted into a primal struggle for survival. Luca, demonstrating the cold compliance of an enforcer, gave a slow nod and promised to hunt the target. Victor then offered Elena a calculated smile, praising her for uncovering the threat. But a profound nausea washed over Elena. Her hands trembled as reality set in. Her brilliance had just signed a man's death warrant. Beside her in the dark vehicle, Marco sat entirely paralyzed. His pale, sweat-drenched face reflected a harsh, inescapable life lesson. Complicity in the darkest human deeds almost always begins with a single, cowardly moment of silence. Upon arriving at the glass-walled penthouse sanctuary, Victor deliberately separated the core group to assert absolute dominance. He immediately launched a preemptive psychological strike on Elena, staring right through her to address her agonizing guilt. When Elena softly confirmed, her voice barely a whisper, that she felt responsible for the impending execution, Victor swiftly dismantled her fragile internal narrative. He reframed the doomed man as a violent aggressor who endangered their entire network. Yet, when she tearfully asked if the man would actually die, Victor did not blink. He confirmed the lethal outcome with a chilling detachment. It points to a stark, tragic reality. Cognitive rationalization is the human mind's most effective shield against recognizing its own moral decay. Victor maintained a terrifying clinical detachment, describing the forthcoming execution as a standard business calculation. Marco, completely unable to process this normalized violence, erupted from his chair in a desperate protest. Victor countered with a masterclass in manipulation, painting himself as a noble patriarch defending his vulnerable family. He argued that showing mercy to the ruthless Vitalis syndicate would guarantee their own destruction. Marco frantically pleaded for any peaceful alternative, but Victor's cold eyes allowed for zero mercy. Elena stepped between them, softly instructing her brother to wait in the hall. The lesson here is timeless. Survival in deeply toxic environments frequently requires violently silencing our most basic human compassion. Let you and I look closely at what happens next. After Marco retreated, Elena attempted to challenge Victor, her voice shaking as she labeled the planned act as definitive murder. Victor effortlessly deflected the accusation. He stood bathed in the city's neon glow, rebranding the violence as necessary justice. He analyzed the situation purely through consequence, noting the traitor understood the bloody cost of betrayal. When Elena questioned the toll this took on his soul, Victor exhibited a chilling calm. He admitted he stopped calculating that internal cost years ago. Elena saw then that mercy was utterly incompatible with his pathology. It is a deeply sobering truth. When we choose to stare long enough into the abyss, it inevitably rewrites our fundamental human boundaries. Victor smoothly agreed to keep her shielded from the gruesome details, a standard manipulation perfectly designed to maintain her compliance. As she turned toward the door, he anchored her with a targeted observation, praising her psychological resilience. When she looked back with hollow eyes and asked if she was already fundamentally broken, Victor delivered a profound piece of dark wisdom. He instructed her to pick up the fractured pieces and put them back together, defining that mechanism as the true essence of a survivor. In the guest room, Marco was spiraling in a severe panic, desperately urging an immediate evacuation. His chaotic, gasping state illustrates a crucial point. Absolute panic is merely the mind's biological inability to accept a terrifying new reality. Marco frantically paced the floor, terrified the authorities would connect them to the impending bloodshed. Elena, however, exhibited a fascinating and terrifying psychological shift. She remained perfectly still, calmly dismissing his rational fears and citing a blind trust in Victor's meticulous methodology. Marco stopped and stared at her, genuinely horrified by the newly calloused exterior hardening over his sister. Elena quietly admitted she deeply craved the intoxicating validation Victor provided. She was no longer just surviving the nightmare. She felt she was building an empire from the ashes. Her rapid transformation teaches a dangerous lesson. The blinding allure of being truly seen can easily override our oldest ethical foundations. Marco directly challenged her shifting morality, his voice cracking as he asked if this validation was worth sacrificing her humanity. Elena absorbed the accusation, accepting the ugly ambiguity of her moral decay. She firmly asserted that the choice was entirely hers to make. As Marco turned away in heavy tears, claiming he no longer recognized the woman standing before him. The psychological severance of their bond was complete. Elena felt a brief urge to reach out and comfort him, but she swallowed it down, mentally trapped by the terrifying uncertainty of their environment. 2 days later, Luca successfully located the target in Atlantic City. We must all eventually accept this hard truth. Familial bonds frequently shatter under the immense, crushing pressure of basic human survival. Elena employed a heavy blanket of willful ignorance. She consciously refused to ask whether the extraction involved desperate begging or physical resistance. She simply sat in the dark, waiting until Victor finally contacted her. When the phone rang, his voice was utterly devoid of emotion, flatly announcing the deed was officially finished. He clinically detailed the absolute destruction of the compromised files, then instructed Elena to take a deep breath, ordering her to release her psychological tension. To cope with her complicity, she aggressively immersed herself in the warehouse renovations, using the architectural blueprints as a paper shield. It clearly shows us a tragic reality. Perpetually busy hands are very often just a desperate distraction for a profoundly guilty mind. Marco eventually submitted to the grim new paradigm, quietly accepting a managerial position at Victor's Brooklyn property. The siblings maintained a rigid, artificial distance. Their rare communication occasions resembled careful maneuvering through a psychological minefield. One evening, Victor stood in the shadows, observing Elena's frantic, compulsive work habits. He astutely diagnosed her defensive behavior, pointing out she was simply hiding from her familial guilt. He softly urged her to repair the emotional fracture with her brother. Elena finally broke her intense focus, dropping her pen to confront the very architect of her ongoing trauma. It is a powerful, haunting life lesson. Avoiding our reflections never erases the deliberate actions that originally shattered the mirror. You and I need to pause and examine this psychological trap. Elena aggressively spun around, demanding to know how to process a murder executed entirely because of her discoveries. Victor seamlessly deployed his megalomaniacal justification, asserting the execution preserved their entire organization. When she openly confessed her bone-deep mental exhaustion, Victor breached her physical, offering a gentle, anchoring hand on her arm. Elena found herself analyzing this contact, realizing with quiet horror that her mental state had morphed into a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. She quietly thanked the very man who orchestrated her captivity. This illuminates a complex truth. Victims frequently, tragically, seek comfort from the exact source of their deepest terror. Victor allowed his touch to linger briefly before withdrawing, leaving her entirely alone with the heavy ghosts of her irreversible choices. Outside the thick glass, the indifferent city continued its chaotic rhythm, completely unaware of the dark behavioral adaptation occurring within Elena's mind. 3 months later, the results of her desperate compartmentalization were physically manifest in the beautifully renovated Red Hook warehouse. Standing amidst the completed industrial space, surrounded by polished steel and warm light, she felt a sudden surge of genuine pride in her creation. The lesson we can draw from this bitter reality is clear. Profound beauty and monumental success can occasionally be constructed upon a hidden foundation of severe moral compromise. This architectural triumph was entirely her own creation, a solitary victory seemingly independent of Victor's suffocating psychological influence. She had successfully managed complex negotiations with city inspectors who remained ignorant of the bloody enterprise hiding beneath the surface. Her moment of quiet reflection was abruptly shattered by a text from Marco, requesting a sudden meeting. She deeply missed the warm sibling, who had previously anchored her reality, but she recognized that the innocent version of him was now functionally dead. She quickly typed a reply, agreeing to meet him for dinner. You and I have probably both made this painful mistake for fate, failing to realize that moving forward frequently requires mourning the innocent lives we leave behind in the past. She silently agreed to meet Marco at 7 in the evening, pocketing her phone and immediately compartmentalizing her anxiety. This is psychological splitting, pushing trauma aside to focus on the trivial details of a lighting plan. By dusk, the expansive skyline was bruised with heavy shades of purple. She drove to the penthouse in a sleek black sedan. Victor had insisted on the car. This is classic narcissism. He deliberately cloaks his dominance as sheer generosity. He forced the car, the expensive wardrobe, the corner office. She resisted at first, but ultimately she surrendered to the luxurious comfort. The tragic lesson here is remarkably simple. Absolute control rarely starts with a violent threat. It usually begins with a beautiful gift you feel too guilty to refuse. The camera captures the quiet death of Elena's autonomy. These tiny compromises systematically erase who she used to be. Stepping into the penthouse, she spots Victor on the terrace. His silhouette is rigid, his Italian sharp into the phone. She holds her breath, slipping away to change, shrinking her world to fit his gravity. Returning, she finds him swirling amber whiskey by the glass. She asks if something is wrong. He promises it will be handled by dawn. The atmosphere tightens. He notes her dress, questioning her destination. At Marco's name, a dark, possessive tension grips his jaw. He reaches out. She steps back. We often mistake a beautiful elation for genuine safety, completely forgetting that a golden cage is still designed to keep you locked inside. Victor orders her to repair the bond with her brother. Family does not vanish over a disagreement, he insists. The camera holds on Elena as she turns his unresolved trauma against him. The sister he lost, the heavy regret he drags like a chain. She asks if that is the lie he feeds himself. His jaw tightens, the visceral reaction of a wounded ego. He quietly admits his failure, confessing his arrogant assumption that they had more time, and warns her never to repeat his mistake. Elena softly agrees. Whiskey draining his gisgit, Victor frames the conflict. Marco's anger is nothing but pure fear. He perfectly ensures she will view her brother through a lens of pity. The profound truth we must face is that the hardest mirrors to look into are usually held by the people who share our blood. Blood, he murmurs that Marco is terrified of losing her. As she nods, Victor dissects her defenses with clinical precision. He notes how her desperate need to appear invincible has severed her ability to connect. It is a brilliantly manipulative diagnosis. Elena has indeed forged a hyper-vigilant shell, cold, competent, untouchable, but emotional armor is heavy, and it exhausts the wearer. She softly agrees to meet Marco. Victor grips her shoulder, a paternal anchor cementing his role as her sole emotional guide. He orders her to fix the rupture before coming back. The scene shifts to her, pulling up to a quiet, dimly lit restaurant. You and I need to understand this. Real strength isn't about building an impenetrable fortress. It is simply finding the raw courage to lower the drawbridge. Marco waits at a shadowed corner table. His face is hollowed by chronic stress, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. As Elena approaches, the air thickens. Then, raw trauma takes over. He pulls her into a desperate, bone-crushing embrace. the physical manifestation of pure abandonment anxiety. His voice breaks as he confesses how much he missed her, and Elena's walls finally crumble. The untouched food becomes a mere prop for this intervention. Bypassing small talk, Marco dives into the pain. He apologizes for his toxic isolation and blind hostility. Elena validates his hurt, is confirming his anger was justified. True apologies are rarely just about admitting fault. They are desperate pleas to restore the gravity that keeps a fragile, broken mind from entirely shattering. Marco rubs his face, a self-soothing gesture, as he admits his cruelty was unjustified. The camera pushes in as he voices a massive breakthrough. It is his lifelong pattern of dodging consequences and using Elena as his caretaker. She reaches out to soften his crushing guilt, but he demands she listen. His eyes are bloodshot with the brutal exhaustion of self-awareness. He systematically tears down his own victim narrative. The debts, the betrayals, the endless failures. He finally owns them all. He names their toxic codependency, admitting that Victor merely took over her role, forcing Marco to face his own inadequacy. We have all seen this tragedy unfold. True growth requires us to stop begging for a comfortable rescuer and finally learn to stare into the unforgiving, cold mirror. The truth lands heavily. She didn't abandon him. She simply refused to drown alongside him. This realization is the crux of breaking a trauma bond. Elena's vision blurs as her emotional suppression shatters. She confesses her terror of walking away. Marco grips her trembling hand, grounding her, and validates her painful escape. He tells her she is finally thriving, no longer just surviving the wreckage. This acts as a cathartic key, and Elena breaks down, weeping openly. She admits her paralyzing fear that removing his safety net would destroy him. Marco squeezes her hand, confirming an erring freefall was indeed real. The most brutal act of true love is often letting someone hit the cold floor so they can finally learn to stand up on their own 2 feet. Anchored together, they sit like exhausted survivors of a shared hellscape finding balance. Their plates arrive, allowing a shift to safe conversation, a desperate decompression after raw exposure. Then, the fragile atmosphere fractures. Marco leans in, dropping the definitive question. Is she in love with Victor? The camera focuses on Elena as her nervous system spikes. Her breath hitches. Her pulse hammers in her throat. She lowers her fork, retreating by whispering that she doesn't know. Marco's eyes narrow. He reads the evasion, pointing out that hesitation is never a denial. She shrinks behind the tired excuse that it is complicated. We constantly use the word complicated as a heavy shield, a polite disguise to hide our most dangerous, irrational human attachments. Elena deflects, testing the waters by asking if her loving Victor would disturb him. Marco is brutally transparent. He admits it terrifies him, fearing the suffocating danger that always surrounds a megalomaniac. He visualizes her being consumed by Victor's violent orbit. Elena attempts a soft, false reassurance, swearing he won't lose her. Marco's hollow eyes lock onto hers, reminding her she cannot guarantee that outcome. Stripped of her illusion of control, Elena quietly concedes, promising only that her eyes are wide open. Marco accepts this fragile compromise, forging a quiet pact in the shadows. They split the check, rebalancing their broken scales, and step into the freezing street. Caution is usually just our favorite rationalization for walking willingly into a blazing fire. Their final embrace is looser, the frantic panic finally dissolved. Driving back, Elena lets the biting wind scrub her emotional slate clean. She knows deep relational fractures take years to rebuild, not just one dinner. But as she steps out of the elevator, Victor is waiting perfectly still in the dim light. It is a calculated surveillance measure to dissect her mental state the second she crosses his threshold. His dark eyes scan every micro-expression on her face before demanding to know how it went. Elena sinks onto the sofa beside him, dragging her raw vulnerability right into the wolf's den. Stick with me here, because this is crucial. Watch how seamlessly she trades one emotional anchor for another. The human mind is tragically adaptable to a constantly shifting gravity. A heavy silence stretches across the room, an illusion of peace. Then Elena drops the match. She confesses Marco's question about her feelings. Watch Victor's reaction. Absolute immobility. The apex predator freezing to analyze a threat. His voice is dangerously soft when he demands her answer. She offers her ambiguous denial, then pivots into a devastating confession. She admits he terrifies her, not with violence, but by offering stability, a concept utterly foreign to her traumatized brain. Victor's knuckles turn white against the armrest. He softly counters, reinforcing that she was never a burden. This is the dark cement of a trauma bond curing in real time. We often crave the things that terrify us most, especially when they arrive wearing the beautiful mask of our salvation. Her voice is hauntingly calm as she dissects her broken mind. She traces her devotion to the night he validated her physical pain, fundamentally rewiring her baseline. She admits, with tragic clarity, that she cannot distinguish between romantic love, deep gratitude, and a raw survival instinct. Victor moves closer, his hand rising with calculated slowness to offer an illusion of consent. He brushes her cheek, donning a crafted mask of self-deprecation. He whispers about his own brokenness, blaming his violent world for his heavy armor. Then he slides the ultimate narcissistic hook under her ribs. He claims she is the only person to ever break his walls. True manipulation rarely feels like being forced into a cage. It feels exactly like you have just performed a breathtaking miracle. The trap snaps shut as Victor delivers a dark vow of possession. He is never going to let her go. Elena's nervous system lights up, her heart hammering as she leans into his chest. She hands over the last shred of her autonomy, whispering to ask what they are doing. Victor plays the benevolent guide, framing the moment as a beautiful mutual discovery. His kiss is meticulously paced, treating her like a fragile artifact. Her surrender is absolute, the dark, inevitable harvest of careful psychological conditioning. When they part, Victor seamlessly injects a dose of paranoia, warning her that the outside world will never understand them. Listen closely. To truly imprison someone, you must first convince them that the entire universe is conspiring against your misunderstood love. Fade in on the D'Angelo file. We see Elena, her jaw set, brushing off the whispers of the outside world. Look closely at Vittorio in the dim light of the study. The corner of his mouth twitches upward, a cold, predatory smile. He has his prize. You and I are going to watch this tragedy unfold, frame by bloody frame. Over the next few months, a montage of signed deeds and restless, pitch-black nights consumes them. She looks right past the violent stains on his tailored cuffs, telling herself his brutality is the only thing keeping her safe. It is the birth of a terrible, quiet surrender. A tragic bond where the hostage learns to crave the very monster who locked the door, mistaking his absolute control for a fierce, protective love. The lesson is simple and brutal. Love built on a foundation of fear is just a cage with velvet bars. The camera lingers on her face as she stares out the window, desperately trying to hold two impossible images of the man she loves. The ruthless butcher and the tender savior. The human mind will bend until it breaks just to survive. By early spring, the heavy steel doors of their renovated warehouse swing open. The cold, cavernous space mirrors the hollow reality of their romance. Tonight, the room is filled with cigarette smoke, clinking glasses, and the low rumble of men who kill on Vittorio's command. As they stand on the iron balcony looking down at the syndicate, Vittorio's heavy hand rests flat against the bare skin of her back. It is not a caress, it is a brand, a physical weight claiming both the million-dollar real estate beneath their feet and the woman who bled her soul to build it for him. Listen to the smooth cadence of Vittorio's voice as he leans in close, his breath brushing her ear. He whispers that she alone turned a crumbling ruin into an empire. It is a masterstroke of manipulation, tethering her fragile self-worth directly to his dark world. In her chest, a dangerous warmth blooms, a rush of pure, intoxicating validation. She actually believes she is laying the bricks for their beautiful future, completely blind to the iron bars closing around her. The camera pans to Marco, her brother, emerging from the shadows with 2 crystal flutes of champagne. His eyes, once hollowed out by addiction, are now bright with a soft, easy peace. He raises his glass to toast them, smiling as he unknowingly blesses the very poison that is slowly killing his sister. Watch the subtle softening of Elena's shoulders when Marco offers his rare, genuine praise. It reveals an agonizing lifetime of being starved for affection, leaving her wide open for a predator to move in. They clink their glasses, drinking down a fragile, fleeting illusion of peace, the quiet eye of a very violent storm. Hours later, the guests are gone. The silence in the massive warehouse is deafening. They stand alone, suspended above the glittering, cold lights of the city. When she softly asks what comes next, his eyes trace the skyline like a hungry wolf. He is already mapping out the next conquest, the next territory. But he spins the narrative flawlessly, painting the endless greed, not as his own violent ambition, but as a beautiful, shared destiny they are building as one. Come with me. We have to ask ourselves the same question that haunts this entire tragedy. Why hand her the reins to such massive power? It is a cold, calculated deflection. By making her the absolute ruler of the legitimate properties, Vittorio shields himself from the blinding lights of the law. While hoarding the gold, he strokes her ego right when her heart is most desperate for his approval. But deep down, the human spirit always knows when it is suffocating. In the quiet of the night, her survival instinct finally kicks in. She looks at the ledger, asking him the hard questions about the blood money funding their empire. Her voice shakes as she wonders if she is nothing more than a beautiful mask for a monster. She is pushing against the invisible glass of her own mind, desperate for a way out. This is the tragic turning point, the moment the light finally dies in the heroine's eyes. She stands before the heavy oak mirror, tracing the lines of her own face, terrified of the hollow stranger looking back. She confesses her fear of the creeping darkness. Vittorio steps up behind her, catching her reflection. His voice is a low, soothing hum, promising they will find the balance together. That one word, together, is a heavy chain wrapped in silk. It binds her moral compass to his rotting soul, dragging her down into the deep. Jump cut to 6 months later. The transformation is absolute. She sits behind a massive glass desk in a high-rise corner office, her posture razor straight. She is the stunning, untouchable corporate queen of a cartel that buries men in the dirt. The camera slowly pushes in on her sleek mobile phone as an unknown number lights up the screen. The ringing cuts through the silence like a siren. It is Detective Sarah Chen, and the moment she speaks the name of the missing man, David Rossi, You can almost see the air leave Elena's lungs. Her blood runs freezing cold. But the tragic conditioning of her survival kicks in. She slows her breathing, her voice dropping an octave as she smoothly denies everything. The detective presses harder, turning the screws, reminding her of her past ties to the dead man. Behind Elena's calm eyes, absolute is tearing her apart. The nightmare is no longer just a shadow in the bedroom. She has to decide in a split second whether to save her own life or protect the very man destroying it. Notice the immediate, heartbreaking tragedy in her body language. She does not call a lawyer. Her hands tremble so violently she can barely hold the phone as she calls the very devil who put her in this hell. This is the ultimate, crushing weight of her psychological captivity. When Vittorio answers, the lighting in his scene is stark, his face entirely unbothered. A predator like him feels no fear, only a brief annoyance at a minor mess. He speaks in a flat, deadpan drone, telling her to breathe. He promises the bodies are buried and the ash has blown away. With terrifying ease, he breaks down her panic, using sharp, freezing logic. He strips away her natural, screaming human instinct, forcing her to swallow his cold psychopathic confidence as if it were medicine. Stick with me here, because this is where we see the true, horrifying machinery of the underworld at work. Vittorio brings in his fixer, an attorney named Rebecca, whose only job is to wash the blood out of the paperwork. For hours, they drill Elena under blinding fluorescent lights. They break her down and build her back up until the lies roll off her tongue like a second language. When she finally pushes through the heavy glass doors of the police precinct, her face is an unreadable, stone-cold mask. Detective Chen watches her every move, tossing out the exact questions Vittorio had warned her about. The cop is hunting for a single twitch of guilt, a bead of sweat, but Elena hits every mark perfectly. She takes her own conscience, locks it in a box, and drops it to the bottom of the ocean. For 90 agonizing minutes, she plays the role of the bored, innocent executive without missing a single beat. But the second the interrogation room door clicks shut and she steps into the cold alleyway, her body betrays her, her knees buckle, her chest heaves violently as the massive wave of adrenaline crashes and burns in her veins. The lawyer gives her a sharp, empty nod, a business transaction completed. But a soul does not simply forget the heavy toll of lying for a murderer. A sickening dread burrows deep into her bones, haunting the shadows of her bedroom and starving her of sleep. Vittorio, always watching his prize, catches the shift in the wind. He steps out onto the freezing terrace, finding her staring blindly at the city below, quietly cracking under the weight of the lie. Focus on the lighting as he steps into the frame, a tall silhouette swallowing the moonlight. When she cries out that their world is collapsing, he laughs, a low, arrogant sound that chills the blood. He points to his 15 years of untouchable reign, fully believing he is a god among insects, immune to the scales of justice. He speaks of trimming the dead branches, a beautiful, horrifying metaphor for the men he is about to slaughter to keep her safe. It is the ultimate toxic vow. He promises to stand between her and his own sins. To any normal person, this would be the moment to run, but the tragedy is already written. Through the warped, twisted lens of her deeply rooted trauma, she does not see a monster covered in blood. She only sees a man wrapping his arms around her shivering frame. Let us look at this terrible moment piece by piece, shall we? She lets out a broken sigh and leans her exhausted body against the broad chest of the man who systematically destroyed her life. The camera pulls back, leaving them in the dark, a flawless, tragic portrait of the spider and the fly. We fade out and jump 12 months into the future. The scene is bright, loud, flooded with the golden afternoon sun at another ribbon-cutting ceremony. The city's elite sip champagne, entirely willing to ignore the bones buried in the foundation. Marco stands by the bar, laughing with a new partner, completely blind to the ghost his sister has become. Elena watches the glittering crowd from the stairs. She feels a deep, soul-crushing gratitude for this fake, fragile peace, mistaking the silence for safety. She looks down at the expensive marble floors, truly believing she has finally found solid ground. She has no idea she is dancing on the edge of a razor. In the quiet shadows of the hallway, Vittorio makes his final, masterful move. He presses a thick leather folder into her hands, the flawless, legal deeds to the entire empire. He crowns her the undisputed queen of a kingdom built on graves. He steps back, his voice thick with a fake, poetic grace, telling her she is completely free to walk away. But you and I both know the dark, heartbreaking truth of this scene. By handing her the heavy keys to his blood-soaked castle, the devil guarantees she will never, ever leave. The great, terrible lesson of life is this: the thickest, most unbreakable prison bars are the ones we forge ourselves. Let us open this case file together, shall we? We are observing the exact moment the trap snaps shut. In the heavy shadows of the study, Victor slides the documents across the desk, murmuring that the choice is hers. Elena stares at the ink, her vision blurring, genuinely believing she sees true freedom. She thinks she holds the power to walk away from his criminal empire. But this is the terrifying, quiet genius of a narcissist. When she chokes back a sob and refuses to go, Victor offers a slow, agonizingly warm smile. He whispers that her staying by choice changes everything. Consumed by profound Stockholm syndrome, she kisses her captor with desperate gratitude. As they part, Victor presses his forehead to hers, setting his final hook. "You know what I realized?" he asks softly. He claims true power means giving those you love the freedom to choose you. Notice how effortlessly he redefines violent coercion as gentle affection. Elena looks up through the shadows, asking if this is love. Victor softly confirms it, brushing his thumb against her trembling cheek. This tragedy is heartbreaking to watch. Elena spent her existence in the margins, carrying the burdens of others. Now, gripping those paper deeds, she feels empowered. She stares at the man who swapped iron chains for invisible psychological tethers, convincing herself she is finally awake. But here is a simple, meaningful life lesson we must all hold on to. In our most vulnerable moments, we frequently make the tragic mistake of confusing the sudden absence of terror with the arrival of genuine love. Victor's world demands constant blood and sacrifice, pure, suffocating chaos. Yet Elena rationalizes that this darkness gave her the chance to rise. She frames her trauma as redemption, convincing herself she is building hope from the wreckage. Nearby, the syndicate celebrates. Amber light catches Marco laughing with Sarah, while Luca raises a glass to toast. Looking closely at Luca, you see the same pain burning behind his eyes, masked by the sickness infecting every soul in the room. They have all tragically fallen in love with their own destruction. Elena silently promises to remember the broken bones and the cold nights of paralyzing fear, resolving never to let it define her. It is a brilliant, devastating defense mechanism designed to protect a beautifully shattered mind. In her mind, she is the victorious Elena Marlowe. She genuinely believes she survived hell and emerged unbreakable, forged in the fires meant to destroy her. She takes pride in choosing a dangerous man and a perilous life, claiming every terrifying piece of it as her own sovereign choice. She tells herself this violent, twisted reality is everything she ever wanted. But as you and I close this file together, we must face the chilling reality of human psychology. The ultimate victory for a narcissist is never just locking the door of the cage. It is convincing the captive to swallow the key and proudly call it freedom. In our final look at Elena, standing in the cold shadows of his embrace, we do not see a woman who conquered her monsters. We simply see a tragic patient who married one.